Testing. Is it okay to start?
All yours.
Okay, thank you. Well, this is the first time I've organized something like this, so I hope it all goes well. Ethan with NCME has been great in helping us organize this, and I think everything's all set up. So thank you for joining us today. I'm Judy Koenig. I'm on staff at the National Academies, and today we'd like to talk to you about some work we've been doing on developing a system of equity indicators. Okay, to give you a sense of the system that we have in mind, I want you to imagine a system like NAEP. And so the features of NAEP that are well known is the NAEP reports are issued on a regular basis. Stakeholders know what to expect and when to expect it. Results receive national attention and inform policy nationwide. The results are disaggregated by race, ethnicity, and other important attributes. And the results are reported by state and district. So to some extent, we have part of the system that we imagine, because NAEP results allow us to track achievement in reading and math, especially over time and by group, and we can identify disparities, and there's lots of ways to report the results, and there's lots of support for users. And so that's what we have in mind here. Only we are recommending that the system go well beyond just achievement test results. Okay. So today we're going to talk about two reports that have been issued by the National Academy of Sciences. The first was a consensus report called Monitoring Educational Equity, and in it the committee made some recommendations about what should be measured and why. This report is denser, and it includes a fair amount of review of research and documentation for how we selected our indicators. And then we also have this report that just came out, which is a derivative of the master report. And this is basically a user's guide, and it's written for non-technical audiences. It's intended for policymakers at the state and district level. So there are people that have been working with us on this. This is the list of committee members that that participated in the first report. Christopher Edley was the chair of that committee, and we have two committee members here today to help present. One is Laura Hamilton with the RAND Corporation, and the other is Sean Reardon from Stanford. I'm going to skip this slide because I've kind of covered it. So I want to give our presenters as much time as possible. So I'm going to flip to them in just a second. So Laura Hamilton is going to be talking about indicators of disparities in student outcomes, and she's going to explain what I mean by that. Sean Reardon is going to talk about indicators of disparities in access to educational opportunities and resources, and he'll explain what that means. And then Natalie Nielsen was the one that led the work to develop the guidebook, and she's going to talk about that. And then we're looking forward to hearing from Andrew Ho with some discussant remarks. So I included this slide just so you'd be able to contact us if you wanted to, or locate the materials on our National Academies Press website. And so now I'm going to try to turn this over to Laura. And
great,
so,
thanks, Judy.
Okay, you got it?
Okay. Yeah, I think. You can tell me if I did the screen sharing thing right. Can everybody see the slide that says indicators of disparities in student outcomes?
Yes.
Awesome. Pass the first test. Okay, so that was not guaranteed. So I'm going to first provide a little bit of background information on the committee's work to define equity and to figure out what an equity-focused indicator system should look like. As we all know, defining equity is not straightforward, and we wanted to make sure that the development of indicators was informed by an understanding of equity that goes beyond simple subgroup differences. So after much discussion and consultation of literature and talking with various experts, we developed a definition that covers 3 aspects of equity. So, so the first is what most people may think of when you talk about equity. It's the documentation of gaps in educational achievement or attainment. This is the focus of a lot of reporting of statistics like NAEP. These gaps are evidence of inequity, but they don't tell us the reasons for it. We also want to look at a fit between resources and student needs. And this is part of an effort to really communicate the importance of understanding the broader ecosystem in which teaching and learning takes place, and the ways in which this ecosystem needs to be responsive to student needs. So this second part of the definition really recognizes that equity doesn't mean giving everybody the same thing. It instead means supports for learning should be designed to help ensure that all students have equitable opportunity to benefit from the education system. And that might mean that you give more or different supports to some students than others. And then the third bullet shows that our committee was highly attuned to structural disadvantages. Because our indicators focus on the education system, we don't propose indicators for conditions like community level poverty or structural racism, even though we do acknowledge that those influence educational outcomes. We also don't address conditions that relate to other areas like public health or criminal justice. Again, we recognize that these influence how students perform in school, but the system we developed is really focused on the education system, how it serves students, and ideally our indicator system should be used in conjunction with other data to get a more complete picture. So then, what is an indicator? We've provided a definition here, which is the one that kind of drove the work that we did. There are lots of examples in education and other fields of indicators. So you can see some here, common indicators that are often published and that we track over time. In education, Judy talked a lot about NAEP, and that's certainly something that has become an indicator that people pay a lot of attention to, and that gets widespread attention and interpretation. As we'll discuss, we wanted to make sure that people aren't interpreting indicators in isolation. So it's easy to look at NAEP scores and come up with a rationale for why you see the gaps that you do. This has the potential to lead to inaccurate inferences or misguided decisions. So one of our goals was not just to come up with a list of indicators, but to think about what a system of indicators should look like to help maximize the likelihood that it'll ultimately benefit children. So to that end, the committee determined that any system should really include 2 broad classes of indicators. The first is student outcomes. So this is how different groups of students are performing on tests, how they're attaining educationally, and how they're engaging in schooling. And I'll talk more about each of those categories in a second. By themselves, the outcome indicators can tell us that we have a problem that needs to be addressed, but they don't tell us why or how. They also create a risk that policymakers and the public will blame students for poor performance rather than looking to the conditions that might be contributing to that performance. So the committee determined that a second category is needed to document students' opportunities to benefit from education and to help us understand potential reasons for disparities in outcomes so that we can tackle them. Sean's presentation will focus on the second category of indicators of disparities in access to resources and opportunities. So as we were thinking about indicators, we identified several characteristics that we determined are really crucial to striking this balance between giving you a sense of what the outcomes are and how kids vary on those outcomes, but also helping users understand that the differences in opportunities that students have to learn and benefit from the education system. So this isn't a full list on this slide, but it's some of the key features we identified. And this being a measurement audience, I think most of these will be familiar to you as desired features in accountability systems or other reporting. So, you know, the need for multiple measures, looking at students' developmental trajectories and how those align with schooling levels, and I'll talk about that in a second. You know, figuring out what are the population groups among whom we want to focus on measuring disparities, and you can read the rest that are on this slide. And the report has more detailed explanation of all of these. What's important about this is that as we started thinking about indicators for each of the outcomes and opportunities that we looked at, there was a long list of potential things we could measure. And this list of considerations really led to constraints on what we were able to propose for the system. So as we thought about indicators of disparities in student outcomes, we wanted to make sure that we were looking at this in a developmental way. So we know that early childhood experiences really set the stage for success in kindergarten and then throughout K-12 schooling. And those experiences in turn help ensure students are ready for post-secondary education and other post-high school pursuits. And so we focused on a sort of a stair-step model that looks at different milestones, understanding which of those are critical for success at the next step, and the outcomes we selected reflect a progression and are predictive of what comes next. And the report has a nice little stair-step figure that someone spent a lot of time making look pretty. So as we developed our list of disparities in student outcomes, we tried to figure out in each stage of development, what are the key things that really matter, that the research says will be important for future success, and that could potentially be measured in a large-scale indicator system, even if they aren't now. So at each stage, as I mentioned before, we identified a lot of factors that could be valuable to track, but we had to weed out many of them because they just aren't really measurable or didn't fit the other criteria that I just discussed. So here's a list of what we came up with. The first developmental stage we focus on is kindergarten readiness, and we look at both academic readiness as well as what are often called social and emotional skills, so self-regulation and attention. And I'll provide a little bit more detail about each of these in a second. At the K-12 level, we looked at learning and engagement. We wanted to go beyond just tests, so we also incorporated indicators of coursework as well as measures of students' engagement in schooling. And then for educational attainment, we look at on-time graduation and post-secondary readiness. And so I'll quickly walk through each of these, and if you have questions, we can go into more detail a little bit later, but I want to leave Sean plenty of time because I think his indicators are in some ways maybe more interesting than these outcomes. So I'll start with kindergarten readiness. So the committee decided, and again, throughout all of this, we consulted several experts and research, and determined that both academic skills and what are often called social and emotional competencies are crucial for kindergarten success and for later success in the K-12 system. So for academic skills, we provided some examples of data collection instruments like the federally funded survey studies, including the ECLSK, as well as kindergarten readiness assessments that many states and districts administer. So there are measures out there that can provide information about kindergarten readiness and conceivably could be administered in a systematic way. We know that a wide range of academic skills can be helpful for children at this age, but we focused on the highest leverage ones. So things like identifying letters and decoding in reading, identifying numbers, counting, those kinds of fundamental literacy and numeracy skills. On the social and emotional side, we focused on self-regulation and attention, so including behaviors like the ability to concentrate on tasks, persist in the face of frustration, and work independently. Research has demonstrated the importance of these skills for succeeding in school in the early elementary grades and beyond. These can be harder to measure on a large scale. There are some instruments out there, and in the report, both the reports that Judy showed you, we provide some examples, but this is one that would need some more development to be usable in a large-scale system. Under K-12 learning and engagement, the selection of indicators here was driven in large part by research showing that while test scores are predictive of later outcomes, other measures can be at least as predictive, if not more so. And the approaches to measuring each of these things will vary by grade level. So K-12 is a big span. What's available and what's appropriate at different grade levels within that span, will vary. So when we talk about engagement, this refers to students' connectedness to teachers, other students, academic subjects, and school. This is hard to measure on a large scale, and we know that an individual student's engagement can vary across classrooms and activities. Student might be highly engaged in math class and not so much in gym class. Not talking about anybody I know. We spent a lot of time discussing measurement strategies and ultimately ended up focusing on data that are likely to be available and that we know are connected with academic performance. Academic engagement can be measured by student self-report surveys, interviews, teacher checklists, or other methods. More work needs to be done to develop indicator system-ready measures in this area. Course performance measures like GPA, research shows that these can predict graduation and post-secondary success. And when measured early on, like in 9th grade, they can be helpful warning signs of potential dropout. This is a category of measures that is really more relevant in the secondary grades than the elementary grades. And then the final category, the one that is maybe near and dear to most of your hearts, is performance on standardized tests. We concluded after lots and lots of debate about this that it's important to measure both status and growth because they provide different information about the nature of disparities and about students' readiness for the next step in their educational pathway. This is one of the indicators for which existing data collection mechanisms are probably adequate. And then the last category is educational attainment. So even though our focus was on K-12, we thought the system should provide information about students' readiness for the next steps after high school graduation. On-time graduation is a commonly used indicator already. It's included in a lot of state ESSA plans, so that one's pretty straightforward. Post-secondary readiness is harder to measure, and any indicator needs to account for the different pathways that students might choose. It can be documented by following students into their post-secondary pursuits using databases like the National Student Clearinghouse, although gathering complete information about where students go and how they perform there is not really feasible at this point. The committee did determine that tracking whether students are enrolled in any type of post-secondary education program is probably most important. We know this is a predictor of later career and financial success, as well as a number of other outcomes. And so, as I mentioned before, while it's valuable to track disparities in all of these outcomes, we need additional information to understand opportunity gaps that students might be facing. So I'm going to turn it over to Sean now to present our indicators of disparities in access to resources and opportunities.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you all for being here. I'm going to talk about the second half of our proposed indicators. So as Laura said, we conceived the set of indicators that a good indicator system should have as sort of one set of indicators that's about disparities in outcomes and a second set that's about disparities in access to educational opportunities. And the reason for sort of thinking about both of those is that the measures of indicators of disparities in outcomes are by themselves indicate where there may be problems in outcomes, but they're not helpful in diagnosing the cause of those problems or in figuring out what to do about them. And so a useful indicator system ought to not just tell us where there are unequal outcomes, but also ought to tell us what kinds of unequal opportunities might be leading to that. And so the second set of indicators is really focused on trying to identify and track and monitor disparities in opportunities. And I think that's useful for a couple reasons. One is it helps us diagnose what might be the source of the unequal outcomes. It can be useful for thinking about targeting educational and social policy. So if we see differences in different kinds of opportunities, that might lead us to think about different policy interventions. And thirdly, and I think very importantly, is that it puts a different frame around the whole enterprise. So as many people I think have noted, if we talk about achievement gaps or the white-black test score gap or something like that, there can be an implication read into that those gaps are the result of differences in ability or something specific to the group. And it can lead to a kind of a frame that leads to identify the problem in the group that is disadvantaged, rather than to identify the problem in structural inequalities and opportunities. And so by having a monitoring system that monitors disparities in opportunities, it helps to frame the problem as structural rather than individual or group-based. And I think that's important to do. So in the second set of the indicators, we have a set of 9 additional indicators of disparities in access to resources and opportunities. I'll talk through each of them quickly and say a little bit more about 3 of them. Let me go. So the first is disparities in students' exposure to racial, ethnic, and economic segregation. And this one, there's a lot of research and some very good recent research that shows that segregation leads to unequal opportunities. The work of Rucker Johnson, for example, showed that segregation in the 1950s and 60s led to long-lasting unequal outcomes for Black and white students in the South. And then when Black students later had access to desegregated schools, their long-term outcomes, their educational attainment, their earnings, their adult health, their children's educational outcomes, all were better than similar cohorts of students who didn't have access to desegregated schools. The work of Raj Chetty and his colleagues shows that segregation is a strong negative predictor of upward economic mobility. So we have a lot of evidence that segregation creates unequal opportunity, and so we thought it important that the indicator system measure the extent of segregation within the system, at both within schools, between schools, and at different levels of geography and aggregation. This is one of the indicators for which we probably have, for the most part, adequate data to do this, but we don't have a national system that monitors this. Some of the other indicators are ones where we don't necessarily yet have the right kinds of data. We have 2 indicators for high quality instruction. One is about access to high quality preschool programs, and the second is access to effective teaching. Now, effective teaching is a thing that we have evidence is widely unevenly distributed among different populations of students, but we don't really have good systematic ways of measuring it or the data available always to do it. Often we use proxies like exposure to novice teachers or teachers with more experience or teachers with different kinds of certifications, but most research has shown those are at best sort of weak predictors of teaching quality. What we'd really like is more direct measures of the quality of instruction that happens in classrooms and the extent to which that is evenly or unevenly distributed among different racial, ethnic, or economic groups. That we know something about how to measure that on small scales using observational protocols or using value-added models of one type or another, but we don't have sort of large-scale systems that can efficiently do that. And so that's going to be an area where we're going to need to sort of think about when we can use proxies to measure it or when we're going to have to think about building better measurement systems. The third set of opportunity indicators are access to rigorous and coursework and curricular breadth. Because we don't have standardized systems for kind of measuring curricular offerings or breadth or rigor, that's going to take some work, I think, to develop kind of comparable measures, but I think it's a doable task. And the fourth and final category of opportunity disparities that we think important to measure are academic and non-academic supports. If you think about the kinds of things that create opportunities for students, they're not just the structural features of schools, like who's teaching and how they're teaching and what courses are available, but some of the less easily measured things. So academic supports, school climate, and non-academic supports. And I think this last one is worth thinking about. We think, and we talked a lot in the committee about the fact that different students have different needs they bring into the school environment. They come from different environments. They have needs for different kinds of emotional, behavioral, mental, physical health supports. They have different experiences of trauma or instability in their neighborhoods and in their homes. And so they're going to need different kinds of supports. And so ideally, what we want to measure is the extent to which children get the kinds of supports that are appropriate for the needs they bring to school. That's not a thing that we have systems in place to measure, because it requires not just measuring the resources available or the supports available, but measuring the extent to which they're appropriately available to students with different levels of need. And so this is the last of the indicators, and I think, to my mind, one of the most challenging to think about how to construct reliable and comparable measures of. But there's so much research that suggests these kinds of supports are important for students, particularly those living in disadvantaged communities, that we thought it essential to include this kind of indicator in an indicator system. So these 9 indicators are, I think, in some ways harder to measure and a little less traditional than the outcome-based measures, standardized test scores or graduation rates. But equally, if not more important to measure, because they focus the attention of the indicator system on the opportunity structure available to kids, and then lead to, I think, inferences about where we might think about targeting policies and interventions. So following the list of the 16 indicators and discussion of them, the committee makes 6 recommendations, and these are shortened, paraphrased versions of the longer recommendations that are in the full report. And I'll just briefly summarize them here. The first 2 are about the federal role in doing this. We don't imagine this as something that should necessarily be run by or a federal effort entirely, but we think it needs to be coordinated by the federal government in the same way that the federal government coordinates other kinds of data collection through ESSA, through some of the NCS data collection systems, and through NAEP. And the federal government has some leverage to help encourage or ensure nationwide coverage and comparability in the same way that it encourages national standardized testing through the No Child Left Behind or ESSA law. And so we think the federal government has a role to play in coordinating, facilitating, and sort of standardizing some of this stuff, even though we don't envision it being sort of entirely a federal effort. It needs to be done at the state and local levels as well. One of the other recommendations is that an indicator system should enable reporting of both disaggregated results, and it should meet that set of criteria that Laura described earlier, that it allows for comparability across place and time based on scientific evidence and those sorts of things. We want ideally to be able to compare the kind of equality of opportunity available to students in one place to students in another place, or across time in order to track how well it's doing. And so we want not just national numbers about equity, and not just state, but also more local at the school or the district level, ideally. The other three recommendations are here. One is that we think there should be some sort of an independent entity, perhaps analogous to the National Assessment Governing Board, NAGB, which oversees NAEP. There ought to be some kind of independent entity that provides governance of the system, makes decisions about which indicators or which kind of how to operationalize different kinds of indicators, ensures kind of quality control and that sort of thing. This fifth one is one that we called out in particular because this is something that's hard to do with current data systems. Many students require supports, non-academic supports, as I mentioned earlier, that involve support systems outside the school. So that might be social service agencies or the foster care system or health services, mental health services. And a good system for providing resources to kids ought to have integrated cross-agency services. Kids ought to be able to access those services in a sort of seamless way. And so in order to sort of meet that last goal, we want indicators that help us assess the extent to which that's possible. That's a bit of a lift from where we are now, I think, with our data systems, but we intended the report to be aspirational in some ways as well. And finally, the committee recommends that both public and private support be involved, that this will require some resources, and we don't imagine those could be entirely private, nor that they would be entirely provided by the public system. So those are a very sort of short version of the committee's recommendations. I'm going to turn it over now to Natalie, who's going to talk about the second component of the report.
Hi everybody, can you see my screen? Is it sharing as a slideshow?
Not yet.
Okay.
There.
Oh, okay, good. All right.
You got it.
Thanks. Thank you. So I'm, as Judy mentioned, I'm going to talk about the guidebook that we recently was released 2 weeks ago. And the guidebook was the idea of Kent McGuire of the Hewlett Foundation, who was also a member of the consensus committee. And the goal of the guidebook was to distill the key messages from the consensus report that Judy, Laura, and Sean just talked about, and to make a more actionable document for states and school districts. I'm not going to read everything on this slide, but basically the guidebook was intended to defang the list of 16 indicators, inspire states and districts to take steps toward creating systems of educational equity indicators, and provide information that would help them to take those steps. So it really is largely the same content from the consensus report, just repackaged, and with some taking additional steps further toward identifying some of the measurement, not issues, but measurement steps that people would take. And so we did this by focusing primarily on what states and districts should measure, identifying the data they might use, and providing examples of data collection instruments and how other jurisdictions are measuring certain indicators or certain constructs within indicators. And as part of the defanging effort, we wanted to call attention to those instances where states and districts already have some or all of the data they need for the indicators, and also call attention to things that they're already reporting on as part of ESSA or other requirements. And that was a deliberate strategy to make the list of indicators seem less overwhelming and more consistent with what states and districts are already doing. This slide gets to the inspire part of our intent with the guidebook. And the hope was that states and districts would start pulling together the right teams, identifying the data they have and the data they need, and then making plans for collecting and reporting on the indicators. And this last bullet is particularly important because what it does is identify kind of where the guidebook stops. So the guidebook, while the guidebook does kind of extend what the consensus report did, it stops short of really getting into concrete steps that states and districts need to take to address some of the, to do more of the development work on the indicators. So I'm just going to show you a few examples. These are tables that show up in the report, in the guidebook, and you see that it starts, it really picks up where the consensus report left off in terms of what to measure, right? So Laura and Sean's slides had the indicator and then what to measure, which is our first column here. And we extended that to kind of identify, to say what data they should use, and then talk about examples of data collection instruments where those are appropriate, and where they weren't, where data collection instruments aren't needed. We really wanted to emphasize you can calculate this indicator, or you can use your existing data to calculate this indicator, and that was, again, part of the effort to, in a way, show that these, that states and districts already have a lot of what they need. They just might need to think about it in different ways, or track different aspects, or disaggregate and analyze the data in different ways. And then the last column, so all of the indicators, we have these tables for all of the indicators, and the last column identifies some challenges and considerations that might come up as states and districts are thinking about developing the indicators. And it's not a comprehensive list, but it's some of the key issues that came up during the, in the consensus report and during the committee's discussions. And so this is, table showing the disparities in access to and participation in high quality pre-K programs is pretty much how all of the indicator tables are laid out, with the information that we had specific to each indicator. This is, okay, and so in terms of access to and participation in high quality pre-K programs, I think this reflects, what Laura was saying about some of the measurement challenges and considerations, and also the types of information that would be used. School climate also reflects the fact that this is, less well developed, or maybe a wider terrain currently. It's not as, there's not quite the convergence on how to measure school climate, which aspects to measure, which measures to use. I'm not going to go through all of these. I just want to give these as an illustrative examples of how the guidebook extends and begins to operationalize what the consensus report did. This is another example of the performance in coursework. And we're back to on this one, I think a notable thing is, we're back to this issue of it can be calculated with data that states and districts already have. We just need to think about it in a different way, maybe. And then another example is the on-time graduation. And you see here, this is, you know, pretty well, there are probably, this is one of the ones with fewest issues to resolve. So the some challenges and considerations column is left blank. I believe this is the only one that it might be left blank for, but you know, it's a pretty well resolved issue. So the last section of the guidebook has a set of recommendations that parallel parallel the recommendations from the consensus report. But Sean mentioned that you know, the ones he talked about were kind of a top-down, the top-down portion of the recommendations. The committee also emphasized a bottom-up approach, and the recommendations in the guidebook focus more on the bottom-up recommendations, part of the recommendations. And so this is what states, school districts, and their partners can do to develop systems of educational equity indicators. The idea here is to encourage states and districts to, in a way, maybe work with other jurisdictions to begin identifying, to get more convergence towards some of the indicators, to get kind of common measures and common definitions. So the idea is that they can incorporate these indicators of educational equity into their own data collection and reporting activities. They can seek public and private funding to support more design work. And they can explore the development of indicators related to integrated services that address the context-related impediments to student success. And that was the recommendation 5 that Sean kind of elaborated on a little bit, saying, you know, how important it was. There's a lot of work, but the guidebook emphasizes that states and districts might begin thinking about how to start developing those types of indicators. So now that the guidebook has been released, we're undertaking a pretty intensive stakeholder engagement efforts. A big part of the Hewlett grant is to try to really engage with the communities who are likely to do something about the recommendations, both in the consensus report and the guidebook, which essentially are the same recommendations. So we're doing, you know, some targeted social media. We're also doing a lot of individualized outreach to key stakeholder groups and likely partner organizations. And I want to emphasize that the goal is to find people who are doing relevant work, people who have, you know, state and district partners, because what we want to do is join the streams of relevant work that are happening, instead of kind of just plopping this in, you know, contextually and expecting people to do something about it. So we realize that that's going to mean that maybe that we engage, ultimately kind of get fewer people interested, but we're thinking that it'll be the people who are doing already or interested in doing this kind of work. So it's going to be a lot of kind of outreach and conversations and tapping into people's networks and, you know, seeing who's doing what and how we can join those conversations and help advance all of this work. And of course, that's going to also involve, you know, we're open to any kind of webinar or convening forum, any opportunities for, you know, blog posts, that kind of thing. One thing that we're talking about, and we're getting a sense of how the field feels about this, is we're thinking about a National Academies Roundtable on the development of educational equity indicator systems. And this would be, membership would be from people from all levels, federal, state, local, advocacy groups, researchers, you know, policy organizations, professional societies. It would be a wide, a broad coalition of people. We think that the kind of charge we would give a roundtable would be to identify the major issues to resolve for the indicators, including their technical adequacy, and then what different stakeholders kind of need pressured about in terms of developing them. A roundtable might outline the actions that districts, states, the federal government, and educational intermediaries and partners might do to address the issues and develop systems of educational equity indicators. And I want to emphasize that the focus would be both on the technical side, what are the technical and measurement issues related to indicator development and data collection analysis and reporting, and also on the kind of policy side, what would the policy issues, what are the policy issues and constraints that come up with this? Again, we're just exploring this idea, and we would love honest feedback from people about whether there's appetite for this. We in no means want to be, we by all means want to be inclusive and respectful of the work that people are already doing, rather than trying to overprint any of that. So if you've got ideas about stakeholder engagement and any follow-up activities that might be relevant or help to advance the recommendations in these reports, you can contact me. The earlier email was incorrect, so please use nnielsen@nas.edu. And with that, I will turn it over to Andrew.
While I bring up my slides, I'm going to pass it back to Judy for a quick remark, and then she'll pass it back to me.
Thanks, Andrew. Natalie mentioned that the guidebook, the funding for the guidebook came from the Hewlett Foundation. And when she did that, I realized that I had not acknowledged all of the different funders for the consensus report. So I'd like to just mention them right now. There were several, AERA, the Atlantic Philanthropies, the Ford Foundation, the Spencer Foundation, the U.S. Department of Ed, the William T. Grant Foundation, and the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. We couldn't have done this work without their support, so we were very grateful. And I will turn it over to Andrew now.
Thank you, Judy. Laura, Judy, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see my slides? Great. So hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Ho. I'm a professor at Harvard's Graduate School of Education, and my first order of business is to show you the sausage and pancakes that my daughter just made in her Zoom afternoon class called Breakfast All Day. I will not be eating this right now, but that's what's going on in the playroom behind me. So if my daughters jump all over me, you'll know that that's to come. So again, I am not a member of the panel, but I have given a lot of thought to these issues for a number of years, and I'm happy to offer my remarks here. I want to start also by saying that I am a member of the board of the National Council on Measurement in Education, and from that perspective, I just want to send my gratitude to Ethan and Tally for organizing this, to Judy for proposing this wonderful session, and to the program chairs for the past program, whom you may remember were anticipating an in-person meeting in April before everything hit, and have done an amazing job continuing their service. That's Thanos Patelis, Ada Wu, and Drew Wiley. And I just wanted to thank them for going way above and beyond to keep the community here at NCME. And it's great to see so many familiar names in the audience right now. It's wonderful that we can continue to come together in these difficult times, and I'm grateful for everyone's support. I'll also say that I'm also a member of the National Assessment and Governing Board, and it's from that perspective that I'll be making a couple of remarks as well. That was mentioned as a model. Sean mentioned it. It was mentioned in the report a number of times as a model, and I have a few reflections on that too. So here is an overview of my remarks. here. So I have 5. First, the reports provide a useful framework and a useful agenda. And I thought it was a nice way to set up a report, is not just providing a bunch of findings and recommendations, but also saying, all right, here's how we make a difference. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Second, how can we be clearer about the importance of foregrounding the measurement of disparities in X over the measurement of X? I think that's a really important question that I found myself grappling with throughout the report. And I think there's real advantage to focusing on disparities in X over X itself. But I think as we think about moving this report forward, we should be much more intentional about that. Third, a question, Laura mentioned this and it's mentioned in the report, how important really is prediction as a criterion for indicators? And I've always struggled with prediction. Of course, we want every single indicator we have to be some oracle of what's going to happen for kids and schools in the future. But it turns out that's not always the case. And I wonder if we can reconceptualize prediction as a criterion for indicators in favor of alternative criteria. Number 4, how can we address and provide guidance for the many scaling issues and other analytic issues in the measurement of progress toward equity? So Sean and I and a number of you in the audience have done a lot of writing about how difficult it is to even, let's say we have some perfect measure, it's still surprisingly difficult to technically grapple with and analytically grapple with the measurement of change over time. And I thought that there's sort of additional room past this report to give recommendations to states, districts, and the potential board in the future, and not to mention statistical agencies, for improving our understanding of these technical and analytic issues. Then 5, and finally, as I mentioned before, what are the compelling features of the National Assessment Governing Board that governs NAEP from which folks might build a movement? So I think these remarks will take me to maybe like 4:10 or so, which will leave us plenty of time for questions. So I encourage you to either start queuing your questions in the chat or not being shy and unmuting yourself and turning on your video for a cue that's going to happen once my remarks are done. So I'll go in this order. First, again, I found this a really compelling, not just a framework, but an agenda. I'm going to throw a couple of tables here that I feel like if I were a state or district office, I would like print out and like paste on my wall. Right? It's like a list of indicators, a list of constructs, a list of domains that if I were a state or a district or an agency, I'd be like, yes, these are the things we want to keep our eye on, not just outcomes, but as Sean mentioned, access, right? The inputs that might, if attention is paid to them, make some difference in the improvement of outcomes. So I thought this was a really helpful table. I'm obviously not going to walk through it all, but I want to point you to it because it's just a hint of what you have to find, what you might be able to find if you look into these reports. Here, in addition, and I want to give Natalie a shout out here, I found this guidebook also extremely useful. Again, a very helpful synthesis for a very particular audience. Again, here's an example of a table that I might imagine myself printing out. You have these domains on the left, you have the indicators of disparities here, you have what to measure, and then you sort of see this helpful column. It's like, is this part of required federal reporting, right? And much of this is not, right? And so it's a call to districts and states and other agencies to step up and to think about that step ladder that Laura was depicting. And I found this a very, very useful table and synthesis. And then, as I mentioned, it's not just a framework, it's an agenda. And I thought this report was strategic, tactical even, about how to get this done. And here's just as an example, again, a lot of text here, but like, here's how you get this done. And you get the funders in place, and Natalie already mentioned, and Judy gave credit to some of them who are already getting themselves in position. And in addition, like, how do we establish something like a governing board that might actually oversee this, that has some independence from the data collection agency to synthesizing the findings in a meaningful way to highlight disparities. So I really like that about this report as well. It wasn't just a framework, and it was a very helpful framework. Even if it stopped there, I think it'd be a massive contribution. But there was also a series of recommendations that I felt formed a necessary set of next steps that we have to look forward to if we want to improve our understanding of these systems and what can make a difference for kids. So that's the first point about, again, great framework and great agenda. Second, I wanted to highlight this because I found myself sort of going back and forth. I think the report actually, if you read it, does a nice job of defending this, but I think in an explanation, it might get overlooked. And I really want to focus on this question, right? So what is the difference between measuring X and measuring disparities in X. And there's a couple ways to rephrase this question, right? First, if we were able to measure educational access and outcomes, just think about that. Just think about the tables that we looked at before. If we were just able to have those measures, how much additional work would it take to measure disparities? And from that perspective, I think you might say to yourself, actually, it wouldn't take that much additional work, right? It's like once you have the measures in place, isn't it just technical, right? To measure differences and to report those differences in a thoughtful way. And I think because we might say, oh, it's not that much additional work, we might I think undersell how important the lens of equity and disparities actually is. So another way to put it is how does orienting the effort around disparities improve measurement and reporting, right? Because I do think this orientation was quite strategic, right? You weren't just saying, here's a bunch of outcomes and inputs to measure. Here is a frame for analysis, for regular reporting, for asking questions, not just of outcomes in general, but in disparities in gaps that we have to close, not just in outcomes, but in inputs as well. So I think that like foregrounding this, right? It's not just like taking X and taking the mean of X2 minus the mean of X1, right? It's really a way of thinking and a way of reporting and a series of research questions that you are asking that need to have greater emphasis in our policy agenda and the public awareness. So I just wanted to highlight that I think that we should be much more intentional than we currently are, and I think the report does a good job of this. But I think in the way we talk about it, like really, what is the added value of orienting this around disparities? And I think that value is immense, and not just a matter of calculating differences and averages after the fact. So my number 3 here, and I stole this little step ladder from Laura's presentation as she was giving it, but there also really is a much more elaborate figure in the report itself that I encourage you to check out. So this is the recommendation. I'm sorry, this animated prematurely, but in the upper left here, this was the recommendation from the report. I think you can see my mouse cursor, right? That there is this progression, and I agree that this progression is a useful conceptual framework. But I have had doubts for some time about, I call it in the context of NAEP, how we subjugate interim measures to future measures, right? That NAEP reading and math might only be worthwhile to the extent it predicts long-term outcomes. And I think that there's a danger there in always looking to the future to over and above the content and the construct that you're measuring itself, right? And so I framed it this way: how necessary is prediction really beyond the meaning and the value of what you're measuring itself to valid interpretation and use of ultimate results? And if there is imperfect prediction, how can we isolate or at least contextualize whether this is due to error in the predictor, error in the outcome, and intermediate factors between these time points? Another classic example of this is the predictive validity, as we say dangerously, right, of college admissions tests for freshman year GPA. And of course, as a professor and as anyone who's graded before knows, it's like, wait a second, GPA? Have you seen what goes into GPA? We're making that the outcome, that noisy measure. So there's a way in which I want to be careful about always being careful about subjugating current measures to future measures. Yes, the step ladder, the steps are a useful conceptual framework, but I want to consider each step on its own merits and not just make it beholden to some correlation to some future indicator that may be imprecisely measured itself and may also have a number of causal clouding factors in between those two time points that might nicely explain why the correlation is low. And I think I'm being a little bit unfair to Laura on the report. They weren't saying these are the only criteria. And in fact, in box 4-1 that you can see in the report, there are they're asking a different question, but criteria for review of existing data systems and publications you can see here. These are, I think, some really excellent criteria for thinking about indicators and how their data are collected and reported. So I encourage you to look at the full report. But it's just I'm sort of protecting a flank here that measures aren't only important if they predict. They are also potentially important in and of themselves. Number four, I think there's room for sort of some next steps here about thinking about scaling issues and other analytic issues around, okay, let's say we have this measure. How do we actually describe a gap and how it changes? And so this title of the slide is 10 Ways to Close a Gap. Sean and I have worked together for over a decade now. And it reminds me of his paper that he wrote, was it 2008 or somewhere thereabouts? I don't think, anyway, it's a report you can find. It's called 13 Ways of Looking at a Gap. It's a riff on Wallace Stevens' poem, 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird. I at the same time, like, I love that poem and remember it. I had a presentation that I gave to him at around this just after that was published, and we were both like, he's like, did you come up with that independently? And so we both have this way of like looking at gaps and gap trends in particular here, as I'm going to show you, and see that there are many myriad ways that we can describe them, and those ways, those approaches have consequences. This is not new to this audience, but I just wanted to emphasize, right? I'm going to show you 10 ways briefly here. This is a slide that actually, as Sean remembers, was part of our Spencer Foundation grant that ultimately led to the creation of the Stanford Education Data Archive and the Education Opportunity Project that he and I have been collaborating on for years. So this is what I'm going to show you here are five ways at the top of describing of having a gap close over time. And I'm going to have little quippy ways of describing that. I think when we think about closing gaps, we like to think that we're raising all boats, right? But that we're closing a gap from some average score of a lower scoring group, that progress is particularly steep over time. So you could say there's a gap closure here. This is the exact same gap closure that we see here, right? Where the high scoring group doesn't change, the low scoring group does, right? This is the exact same gap closure that you'd see here that we'd say is zero sum, where the higher scoring group is actually closing the gap because it is declining, and the lower scoring group is making gains over time. Here's what we call drop the top, if you will, which is to say the lower scoring group is making no progress and the higher scoring group is declining. And of course, sink all ships, right? Where the two are both declining but one's declining faster than the other. So all of these are closing the gap, but they have dramatically different substantive interpretations. And the pitch here is just measure levels, right? We can't just look at relative performance over time. We actually have to be able to compare from this year to previous years, as for example, the National Assessment of Educational Progress does. But this isn't the only challenge, right? So here are 5 other ways that we can close a gap that are sort of more technical and yet still important in nature, right? First is we can blur the top, as I've described here. And you can see these little parentheses that I've drawn here are showing increasing variance, right, in this higher scoring group, right, at this second time point. And that leads to greater overlap between these distributions in a way that, in a relative fashion, closes the gap. Right. Similarly here, we can blur the bottom. If there's increase in variance for the lower scoring group, that leads to a relative overlap of the two distributions that, defined a certain way, one would call a gap closure, even if the average scores are the same. Third, right, we could have an increase in variance or potentially measurement error, right, for both groups, right? Fourth, here's a scaling issue, right? We can stretch the bottom, right? What if there's a nonlinear transformation of the scale where we say, even though it looks like these lines are parallel, what if I tell you that making gains for lower scoring students, right, is harder in some way and therefore deserves to be magnified in some way? And this is yet another way in which an analytic decision can change the depiction of an interpretation of a gap closure. And finally, of course, you can say, well, maybe maybe it's actually very easy to make gains at the top end of the distribution, so I can have a nonlinear transformation that squishes that higher end of the score scale. Since it's easy to do, we're not going to count it as much, and as a result, it looks like we're closing a gap. So here are just, again, 10 ways that all have the same apparent gap trend over time, but have very, very different substantive interpretations. And what I would say here is that I put this sort of side by side as like well, if I want to push 5% further past this report and get into some of the analytic technical challenges that states and districts and national centers might face in reporting gaps, there's been good work on this that could be synthesized and summarized about what questions each of these is really asking and how to best report on progress towards equity over time. In addition to these, like not to mention these 10, right, here are 3 other considerations that complicate gap measurement over time. First, whether there's cross-sectional versus longitudinal data, right? I haven't even told you whether these are the same kids over time or not. Number 2, whether there's static or dynamic group membership, right? Whether we're talking about a racial group where once you're a member of a race that rarely changes, right? Versus an income group where it often does, right? And so that's yet another complication here. And then the third, gaps within schools and districts and states versus between them. If we take a hierarchical multi-level perspective on gaps, then we might want to be able to disentangle where gaps are at different levels. So there's a whole sort of set of considerations that I think are important for us to consider analytically and technically from a scaling perspective and a technical perspective and a conceptual perspective, really, in the measurement of progress toward equity over time. Fifth and finally, I want to reflect briefly on the National Assessment Governing Board. I'm finishing I'm sort of sad about this. My last meeting is coming up in a month after an 8-year term on the board, and I miss it dearly, and I will miss it dearly. As you might imagine, we have a lot of things we're considering right now about the measurement of progress over time in the COVID-19 era. And I just want to offer a few quick reflections about why I think this report was so thoughtful in calling out the governing board as a potential model for this. So a few features, I'll just mention 7 quickly here. The Noah's Ark representative membership of it, right? Governors from different parties, state legislators from different parties, 3 testing and measurement experts, who cares about them? The 4th grade teacher, the 8th grade teacher, the 12th grade teacher. It's a lovely and sort of reflects the national consensus you need to have the authority to measure these indicators like achievement appropriately. To the national consensus approach, just because as a board doesn't mean we make all the decisions on our own. We are informed through this national consensus approach to developing frameworks. I think that would be what you'd want to have as well, not just like a board that makes decisions, but a board that makes decisions informed by national consensus from experts as well. Third, here's a tricky one, right? Am I really writing this down? The ability to set achievement levels. They've grown in my esteem over time, right? For all the problems with proficiency, being able to say that there is a standard has incredible and compelling clout, right? And it makes you wonder, right, for all of these measures, would you want to grant the authority to say, actually, this much is good enough? Or to even say, like, this pace of gap closure is fast enough, right? Those are some compelling questions that I think, in addition to just reporting numbers, to saying, actually, no, how good is good enough is an important potential role this board could play that certainly has imbued the governing board with considerable authority. Fifth, as you mentioned in the report, comparability across states, large districts, and time is an essential feature. I agree. I never thought about just how important this was, the regular reporting of it. You highlighted it really well in your report, just how necessary it is to, instead of having these sporadic reports, have like, oh yeah, every 2 years NAEP comes out. And that I thought was just a really thoughtful, and it never crystallized to me just how important it is that we are looking forward to that report at this time every other year. Independence from the collecting agency, I think, is very important. And then finally, this sort of natural and healthy tension both within the board and between the board and the agency, to those who would push the envelope versus those who would sort of stick to your knitting. And those are terms that David Driscoll, who was a former governing board chair, introduced me to when I first started on the board. I think that's a very healthy tension and one that would lead to important results from such a board should it come to pass. So again, in conclusion, the reports are great. How can we be clearer? And maybe to kick off the discussion, if the panelists would like to respond to this, the measurement of disparities in X over the measurement of X. How important is prediction? How can we address and provide guidance for the many scaling and other technical analytic issues in the measurement of gaps over time, and the compelling features of NAGB? With that, Judy, maybe I'll defer to you about how you want to proceed, but it looks like we're starting to get a few questions in the chat. And thank you again for this opportunity to respond to these great reports.
Thank you, Andrew. That was a very thoughtful set of questions and comments. And so I'd like to start by letting our presenters have a chance to respond to anything that Andrew mentioned. Laura, Sean, or Natalie. I'm sorry, there's people's faces all of a sudden appeared on my screen and I was distracted by that. Laura, Sean, or Natalie, is there anything you'd like to comment on? I'm sure Sean has something.
Thanks, Judy. Yeah, Andrew, thanks for those great comments. I just want to echo the point you made about the difference between measuring disparities in X and measuring X. And this was a thing the committee talked a lot about and consciously decided to emphasize in the report. It's that while certainly everyone's interested in sort of levels going up of good things and outcomes and so on, in order to really call attention to the equity dimension, it's really important that the disparities in outcomes and the disparities in opportunities be foregrounded. So really I don't have anything else to say about it other than that was a very conscious and sort of key piece of our thinking. And we wanted to make sure we distinguished this from just an educational indicators report that was just sort of a how's the country doing on these different dimensions. And if you drill way down, you could see, whether there's differences by subgroup. But we wanted the differences, the disparities, or the progress on eliminating those disparities to be in the foreground for this purpose, which isn't to say you wouldn't also want to know about levels. Like if you said, oh, the gap is narrowing, it'd be great to know which of those 10 or 30 different ways it's narrowing. But first and foremost, we want to know if the disparities are narrowing and for whom and where and over what time period. So thank you for reiterating that, and that's all I want to add on that.
I'd also say that the guidebook takes a step in that direction. So the constructs to measure in the consensus report were just a statement of the construct, so effective teaching. But the guidebook says under what to measure says group differences in X, Y, or Z, whatever the construct to measure is. So it brought, I think, additional level of attention to what was there in the consensus report and the committee's intent.
Yeah, and I'll just add, just to reiterate, Andrew, those were really thoughtful comments, and definitely we'll be thinking more about them. And the breakfast all day class, or whatever that is, that's a good class. I want to take that. The one thing I wanted to respond to was the point about prediction, because I think we completely agree with the limitations of focusing on prediction as a criterion for whether to measure something. But it was actually the GPA point is one that I think we spent a lot of time talking about, and I'll credit Elaine Allensworth and the work she did with colleagues at the Chicago Consortium for, I think, making a compelling case that despite differences in grading standards and weighted versus unweighted courses and so forth, that there's meaningful information in GPA. And I think that without that predictive information, we might have not gone down that path because it's such a problematic measure. So I do think it makes a lot of sense to not overemphasize prediction, but at the same time, I think it's helpful if you can document that this is actually something that matters for kids' futures, so let's track it.
Okay, so where are there questions from the audience? Are there, I'm gonna ask Ethan or Andrew this. did people submit questions by the chat or?
It's like Gabriel Rodriguez is raising his hand. There's a raise hand function you can use, or you can feel free to just chime in. Why don't we start with Gabriel?
Okay. Go ahead, Gabriel.
Sorry, I had trouble unmuting myself there. So thank you so much for this presentation. It's been really great to listen to everybody. Currently at UMass, I'm working on a longitudinal evaluation of EL academic achievement and disparities in access to educational services in the state of Massachusetts. And a lot of the indicators that have been brought up today really do serve as a good framework. We have continued to come up against some problems when we look at the data where the amount of students who either drop out, are chronically absent, or have a lot of disciplinary issues, so they spend a lot of time on suspension, or it really limits our ability to make some really good inferences about what's happening. And I was wondering if this is something that has come up in your research, and what ways have you looked at as a way to get around them?
And Sean or Laura, do you want to take that? Or Andrew?
Gabriel, I missed the early part of your question, so I think I didn't quite get the context.
We're looking at evaluating English learners in Massachusetts, and in the state of Massachusetts over the past 2 decades, dropout rates for English learners have been sometimes 3 times that of non-English learners. The chronically absentee rate for them is also incredibly high compared to non-ELs. And all of these things make making inferences based on the data that we have difficult a lot of times when we look at these same indicators that are being discussed, because the sample that we're looking at ends up being much smaller, especially when we're looking at longitudinal data.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a common problem. You know, we're certainly in better shape now than we were 10 years ago, because most states have state longitudinal data systems that track kids across schools or across districts as they move, which helps a lot, but those systems don't track students as they drop out of the educational system or move out of state, across state lines. And it's often hard to distinguish what's a dropout in the kind of traditional sense of the word versus leaving the state, leaving the system, moving to private school, you know, any number of things that happen not unique to English learner students, but more pronounced in some places, particularly in the older grades, and particularly for English learners and some other subgroups. So, you know, what we've sometimes done is just try to put bounds on our estimates, because we sort of have some unknown information. The other thing I think is important that's to do with English learners is to track students by whether they were ever an English learner. A lot of data systems kind of report data for 3rd graders who are English learners, and 4th graders, and 5th graders, and 8th graders, and so on. But obviously, as students become proficient in English and transition out of English learner status, you end up with an increasingly selected pool of students called English learners. And so that is a different kind of selection problem, but it's one that's solvable if you sort of categorize students as ever English learners, and then you kind of track them as a group. It's harder, you know, to know how to solve your problem, which is the kind of dropout and attrition problem. And I think until we get data systems that do a better job of tracking kids out of school, that's going to just continue to be a problem.
Yeah, one thing we didn't talk about much or at all in this briefing is the sort of the level at which we'd report in this indicator system. And so I think that for the most part, we have in mind something, again, like NAEP, where you might report at the national level or at the state level, where your sample sizes for some of these groups are big enough to make inferences. But we also did talk as a committee about, how you could make the system so that it's useful for district decision making, so potentially having district or school level reporting. And that's just another sort of set of decisions that would need to be made is where do you want to be able to make these inferences, and to what extent is that feasible given some of the sample size problems that you're talking about.
Okay, I'd like to move along to the second question. I don't know how to pronounce the name, Edward.
Oh, sure. It's Ed Dieterle, and I'm with ETS. Andrew, I was really intrigued by your slide number 4, and I think you would agree that not all ways and not all factors are created equally, and the idea that some might be riskier and some might be more constructive. I wonder, have you done much writing about different ways of interpreting those 10 different ways of closing gaps, and also the 3 different complicating factors?
I can bring this up again. So I definitely point you to Sean's 13 Ways paper. Sean, I think it still exists as like a report. Did it ever get, it's like one of the most highly cited unpublished reports I think I've ever seen, but I'm not sure if it ever got placed in a journal, or maybe I just keep citing the report by accident, but
no,
it's easily...
it's one of those cases where I wrote it and moved on to something else and forgot to ever publish it, but yes,
it's a great piece. Dave Quinn has a bunch of good work on this. He's at USC or Rossier. I have a 2009 piece in JEBS about measuring gap trends in non-parametric ways. The problem with proficiency paper is actually a specific case it's an ed researcher paper I wrote in 2008 that is sort of a specific case of this, where you expect gaps to increase and then close just because of the shapes of distributions. That when more people are next to the cut score, they tend to all fall across it. Whereas if there are very few people near the cut score, then they don't. It's very simple. So those are the kinds of papers that are all related to this problem. And I'll just emphasize here that this problem is like particularly salient in the measurement of gap trends. So gaps are very robust, trends are mostly robust. It's this difference in differences, right? Difference in differences where this problem occurs. Another way to put it is interaction effects, right? So it's that measurement of difference in differences where all of these issues, which are always sort of here's where they sometimes, in particular, in many cases, often reverse key interpretations about whether gaps are increasing or closing over time. So there's been a lot of good work on this from some of the folks that I've mentioned. Sean, you might have other sort of key papers that you can think of too.
No, and that's the list I would have suggested as well.
Okay, someone in chat asked about, let's see, about similar work at the college level. That was from Bethany, and I wondered if anybody could respond to that. I'm trying to find the exact question. I can't, but I don't want to use up too much time trying to find it. Does anyone have?
The way I might ask the question is, how did you decide on your scope in your report? You were like, these are beyond the scope of our report. And how did you decide on those bounds not to go to sort of adult education, for example?
Natalie?
Yeah, The sponsors decided that for us. We originally, the report was actually conceived of really pre-K through college. And Mike McPherson in particular at Spencer said, don't even open up the Pandora's box that is post-secondary education. It would be a study unto itself. And so thus the scope was narrowed. They did think that it was useful to go into the, beyond just high school graduation to the transition to post-secondary pursuits. But that's how it got to be that focus.
I would add that it's, I think it's challenging enough to think about a consistent, comparable, meaningful set of indicators of educational equity at the pre-K to 12 level, or things just get more and more complicated the more choice and selection processes kind of enter into systems. So high school, it's more complicated to think about curriculum, for example, access to curriculum, and college and post-secondary gets even more complicated because of the selection into whether one goes to a college, what college one goes to. And so sort of thinking about defining equity in a system characterized by high levels of choice, but where choice is constrained and limited by people's both prior opportunities and by their resources and by other societal structures. It's not entirely unconstrained equal choice, but it's also does have an element of choice. And so it becomes very hard to conceptualize what equity looks like or how one would conceive of indicators of it. And so we were sort of in some ways happy that Mike suggested we punt on the post-secondary thing, since it was, a challenging lift, I think, to think about a coherent system in the PK to 12 space to begin with. But it's certainly important, and I think, an important next step as well.
I think we're at time. I just add that to the program chairs or Ethan, in the future, I think I might have another presentation coming up in August. We should do a happy hour after the end of one of these. How does that sound?
Sounds especially good for those of us on the West Coast.
That's right. Anyone in Hawaii? It was great to see you all.
Yeah.
Judy, any closing remarks?
Well, I wanted to, I liked Andrew's first couple of points. Get the books, read the books. They're free. You can download them. Tell your friends about them. And please feel free to contact any of us if you have any comments that you think about afterwards. Thank you so much for participating in this. Goodbye from me.
Thank you all.
Great to see you all.